Welcome to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. Today, Ross Clark from CIBC Wood Gundy says GDP indicators are disappointing. Trends Journal publisher Gerald Celente believes Cuba will be the next hot investment. International forecaster editor James Corbett thinks China is hiding important economic numbers. We'll talk to Ross Clark right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600. Welcome to This Week in Money, the source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Ross Clark, investment advisor at CIBC Wood Gundy in Vancouver. Welcome to This Week in Money, Ross.
It's nice to be with you, Jim.
GDP, gross domestic product, is it looking gross?
It's looking a lot weaker than it had been. The first quarter of the year, month by month, the numbers weren't looking terribly good, but they were showing some positive numbers. But the revisions that came out at the end of this week we now show that the Canadian GDP down 0.6% on an annualized basis, and that's clearly about a full point lower than the estimates were. Immediate reaction as far as the currency was concerned, the Canadian dollar dropped about 0.5 to 0.75 in the next couple of minutes, worked its way back during the day to close just down marginally, but clearly with soft numbers like that, there's continued talk and speculation now about a follow-up rate cut in Canada that may come later in the year unless we start to see a pickup in economic activity. U.S. side, the port strike and cold weather issues in the States maybe part of the reason for it or blamed as for the reason, but first quarter GDP numbers in the States revised now to being negative as well, so they're down 0.7%. And this has been with all of this big QE money that's poured into the systems for the last few years, everything that was done to try and stimulate, and we're just not seeing good numbers there. So the result, you've had, with that type of weakness, the bond market has started to turn and have a bit of strength because the thought now is that raising of rates is probably put off for a little bit. And bond market's been down pretty hard this year. So it's, and we're into what would be a seasonally buoyant period from the latter mid part of May in through the summer. Doesn't have to be a raging bull, but it looks as though we're going to have some strength in here for the next little while.
Is there anything that's looking better right now?
Well, when you do get into the position where you've had a sell-off, yields start to look attractive on some of the equity markets, in particular the utility stocks, which have been down pretty consistently. They've started to look pretty attractive in here. So Canadian utilities definitely got some names if people are interested, and they can give me a call. We can take a look at them. Some decent yields and some good solid names that have been doing well the last few years and have taken a breather for this last 3 or 4 months.
Is there any one sector that's really been hammered lately?
Well, without a doubt, and we've talked about transports off and on since the early part of the year. They have really become the dogs in here. Dow Transport Index is down about 10% from its highs, and the rails, the big rail names, are down close to 20%. So by definition, clearly they're into that classification that would be considered a bear market. Canadian side, truckers are down about 14% from the highs. The two big railways, you're down about 16%. And, at this rate, they're going to start to look attractive pretty soon. But it's been a tough ride for those that have been on that road.
Ross, anything else we should be looking at?
Well, currency-wise, the Canadian dollar had that good run into 2 weeks ago, sold off pretty much, I think, 9 out of the last 10 trading days on the downside, way oversold as far as the short term is concerned. But I think, a bounce in here, maybe 1 or 2 cents, and then reassert the downtrend again. The best ones that we talk to in terms of analysts are talking about a Canadian dollar in the 75 to 77 range, probably as a target for the second half of this year. And the U.S. dollar, which had a good pullback to the downside 2 weeks ago against the basket of currencies, it had a great couple of weeks on the upside. Looks a little ahead of itself, but the thought here is that we've still got at least maybe another 2, possibly 3 years on the upside for the U.S. dollar.
What would be responsible for the drop in the Canadian dollar?
Well, you've got, the real estate market here in Canada is definitely one that's overstretched as far as that things are concerned. Just the slowing economy in general. You're not going to the interest rate spreads between Canada and the U.S. You could see that narrowing. With Canadian rates maybe coming off a little bit more again, so the hot money would tend to move away from there. And there are, just in general, fund flows have been going to the U.S. from basically everywhere around the world. It's the go-to market these days.
Ross, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
And we'll be with you next week there, Jim.
And if you have any questions for Ross, his email is ross.clark@cibc.ca. Coming up next on This Week in Money, Trends Journal publisher Gerald Celente.
Always consult your investment professional before making any investment decision. This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
My guest is Gerald Celente, publisher of the Trends Journal, available online at trendsjournal.com. Gerald is speaking to us from picturesque Kingston, New York. Welcome back to This Week in Money, Gerald.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
First of all, tell us about Occupy Peace this September.
Well, the United States is involved in foreign entanglements nonstop, and at a time when our country is deteriorating both in income inequality now is at levels beyond what it was during the Gilded Age. Our infrastructure is rotting. The jobs that are being created pay very low wages. And we're squandering our resources, something that General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and of course President Eisenhower, when he left office, a 5-star general when he was general, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, had warned us that the military-industrial complex was robbing the nation of the genius of its scientists, the sweat of its laborers, and the future of the children. Well, here we are, robbed. So Occupy Peace is, you mentioned, we're in beautiful Kingston, New York, colonial Kingston, and we're at the most historic four corners in the United States. The seeds of democracy was sown here. It's the only place in the United States where there's a stone building that on each corner that predates the Revolutionary War. And this was the first capital of New York State. And the state's constitution was written right here at the courthouse. And that constitution, 90% is taken from that constitution that became the Constitution of the United States. So we're honoring thy founding fathers, beginning with Washington, a real commander-in-chief, one that fought the wars, not one of these guys that they roll out the red carpet for, calls themselves commander-in-chief, and then they go play golf, shoot basketball, play pool, or drive pickup trucks. He's the real deal. And he warned us of no foreign entanglements, his words. And the world was at war back then. Anybody forgot, Napoleon's famous march to Russia, and war after war going on. And then you had Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Adams. Each one of the founding fathers warned us about no foreign entanglements. So Occupy Peace is, again, it's to honor thy founding fathers. Bring home all the U.S. troops. Seal the borders. Rebuild America rather than nation building around the world. that's only draining our resources and destroying countries, as we can see from the Peace Prize President Obama's destruction of Libya and the chaos it has sown over there, to now supporting those so-called moderate rebels that have killed over 300,000 people in Syria, millions of refugees. The ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has been nothing more than disaster, murder, hate, and squandering of resources. So Occupy Peace that we're going to be holding at the Colonial Corners in Kingston, New York on September 20th, this coming September, is about just that. And we have plans in place. There hasn't been a war that the United States has been in since World War II that has been declared by Congress. All done by El Presidentes. And so we're demanding that Congress declare war if we're going to get involved in any foreign entanglements. And more than that, that the people in each state will vote whether or not Congress, their representatives, should vote yes or no to go to war. So we're putting in place tangible actions rather than this is more than a rally, where people yell, scream, pray, and do nothing when it's over. This is going to have tangible takeaways. And we're having a conference leading up to it that week. And one of the speakers is going to be Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, the former Assistant Treasury Secretary of the United States, and a man that is very pro-peace as well. So we have a lot more planned, and that's just the beginning.
One thing I wonder about with the U.S. is trillions are spent on defense, and yet 45,000 people a year die in the U.S. due to a lack of health care. Why can't the U.S. bring in a health care system like Canada or Britain or Germany or France that's public?
Well, because it's a takeover. You go back to our trends journals and go back to 2008, and we called it D.C. Heist. Wall Street's hijacked Washington. It began with the too big to fails. It pushed it in front of everybody's eyes. In capitalism, there's no such thing as too big to fail. It's fascism. It's the merger of state and corporate powers. And the corporations have taken over the country. I don't have to only go to too big to fails. You look at Obamacare. It's not socialized medicine. We, the people, are being forced to buy health insurance from private corporations. And now you're looking at them, they're raising their rates 40, 50, 60% around the country. It's a total takeover. All the laws that were put in place to prevent the big corporations, the robber barons called back in the old day, from being robber barons, were taken away beginning with Jimmy Carter, pushed through with Reagan, put on high speed with Clinton, and continued under Obama and Bush. So you see the deregulation of the communications industry, the deregulation of acts they had in place, Glass-Steagall with banking, Robinson-Patman, Sherman Antitrust Act, Clayton Antitrust Act, that allowed the bigs to grab everything. So that's, one of the trends we talk about is slavelandia. That's all this country's become. And you work for one of the multinationals, you get lousy wages, and there's no more drugstores anymore, or rarely any, I should say. Now you have CVS, and you have Walgreens and Rite Aid. And then you look at all their other vertical acquisitions in healthcare. All you're doing is working for slavelandia. You look what's happened in the entire healthcare system. One major corporation after another. They own most of it, and you work for them. You used to be a thing called stationery stores. Now there's Staples. And there used to be Office Depot, and that's been bought out by Staples. So it's in one area after another, in retail, in communications, in pharmaceuticals, in healthcare. There are no public services anymore. They're multinationals, and we're all employees on the plantation economy of slavelandia.
Is the FIFA scandal the beginning of a trend against corruption, and is that good for the markets?
Go back to last Wednesday. What happened? You pick up the paper, there's a tiny little column on the right-hand side of the New York Times. Banks admit scheme to rig currency price. Go back a week, and here you have in the Wall Street Journal, tiny column down the bottom of the fold, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 column spread. One column. Banks pay $5.6 billion to settle U.S. probe. Now pick up today's New York Times and Wall Street Journal. It's splashed across the front page. The big scandal, accused of rampant, systemic, deep-rooted corruption. Isn't it something? The banks pull off the biggest heists in history, and they barely report it. Not one head rolls. But boy, you pick up the New York Times, and they have all those heads under the FIFA so-called scandal, but they didn't show any heads of the Wall Street gang. Yeah, they didn't have Jamie Dimon's head up there, you know, the guy that was J.P. Morgan Chase head, or the people from Citigroup, or the other banks that were called into the scandal. What a sham. What a joke. America's turned into a feudal state. Neo-feudalism. There's two different sets of laws. There's laws for we, the little people. Then the big cats got their own laws, and they're above the laws. You haven't seen one head roll. And when we talk about the currency scandal, we're talking about rigging the markets that trade at $5.3 trillion a day, and the Attorney General admitted that it's been going on since at least 2007. They were accused of felonies, and not one head rolls. But here they have this football scandal, which in the United States, most people think, you know, the Giants and the Jets. You know, this isn't the big soccer country of the world. And it's ironic, of course, that this is happening just at the time, on the eve, when it's going to be the re-election of the organization's chief, who they might think likes Russia, because after all, you know, the 2018 World Cup from Russia, you know, maybe this is giving them some pressure not to have it. So I think it's just a lot of publicity, and it shows the duplicity of what we used to call the Justice Department. Now the word is just us. Here in the States, you know, cops, man, they're hiding behind bushes to see if you're wearing a seatbelt. And then they radio to their buddies up ahead to pull you over. Where'd you come from? Do you have anything to drink? Get out of the car. Walk a straight line. Stand on one foot, twirl your arms, and repeat the alphabet backwards. And if you don't do it perfectly, they handcuff you, throw you in your squad car, and take you to the police station. You have over 3,000 people in this country that are doing lifetime sentences for nonviolent crimes. But hey, rig the banks? They're just called, missteps. Or they misstated. You haven't seen one head roll with the series of billion-dollar fines that have been going on. Again, it's only justice, just us. Get caught with a piece of crack the size of a kernel of popcorn, whew, you got 15 years in front of you. But rob the world blind in front of everybody's eyes? Yeah, they'll roll out the red carpet for you to have dinner with Obama and the rest of the congressional bandits at the White House. Come on, what is this whole big scandal? They wash it under the rug when they whitewash it when it's the banks, and this other thing, you know, it's big news, and it has nothing to do really with the United States, because ostensibly these, if they were crimes, and of course the prosecutor of the United States, according to the media, has already said that these committee members have committed a crime, you know, without any judge, jury, or trial. You know, but again, the banks get a free ride. It's kind of like, you know, the drone strikes where they kill people in foreign lands because they're suspected terrorists. You can kill anybody you want if they're suspected. Again, two sets of laws. It's neo-feudalism in the United States. Democracy is dead.
What about warnings Canadians are getting about not carrying large amounts of cash if they go cross-border shopping, which in Vancouver is one of our favorite sports?
Yeah, well, again, there you go. And it's all going into, you know, let's break the little people's chops. Let's really make life miserable for them. Well, oh, you mentioned crossing the border, right? If you're one of the economic elite, you're on your Gulfstream, man. You don't go through TSA. You don't get felt up by freaks. You don't get your body, X-rayed. You have a special gate that you go to. and they'll salute you as you walk through. So again, different set of rules. And also it's part of, discouraging people to spend cash with the cashless society that's moving more and more forward. And as you can see, all the Googles of the world and all the others are putting out those apps so that it makes it aptly easy for you not to dig into your pocket and get used to those greenbacks or loonies and just go with the digital dollars.
Why would the government want us to go to a cashless society?
So they can control us more. They know how every penny's being spent. Why are they listening to everything that we do? Why are they watching everything that we do? Again, not for the big guys, only for us. Because, hey, you're a big guy, you could park your money in the Cayman Islands or any of the other offshore places. If you're a big guy in a big company, like the Googles and the Microsofts and the rest of them, you got those companies set up in Ireland or somewhere else where you're paying very low taxes. So again, it's more control of we the little people.
Trends in the markets, where are the majority of people putting their money?
Well, the majority of people, they lack the money. There's not a lot of extra cash out there. For the people that are, they're being forced to play the equity markets because of these 0% interest rates. And if you put your money in a Swiss bond, Jim, you're a nice guy. I got a deal for you. I got a 10-year bond for you. Buy it now, and in 10 years, when you cash it in, you're guaranteed to get less money. Yeah, I'm doing it because I like you. Oh, you don't want the 10-year? I got a 5-year German bond over here. Don't worry about it. Same deal. Buy it at this price, cash it in. We'll call it negative yields. You get less money than what you paid for it. But you got security, I tell you. I mean, come on. Where are you going to go? The whole thing's one big Ponzi scheme. So for me, and I don't give financial advice. I believe in gold. This Ponzi scheme at some time is going to end. And the central banks are doing everything they can to drive down the price of gold with these naked shorts because of the commodities exchanges. Matter of fact, if people go to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts' website, there's a story up there recently, once again, on how they're shorting the markets to keep the price down. But at some time, that's going to explode. This is one big Ponzi scheme, not only in the U.S., it's worldwide with these money-pumping schemes from China, from Europe, Japan, and North America.
Is Cuba a good place to invest for the future?
Yes, that's going to be the big one. For better and for worse, it'll probably turn into another Cancun or a suburb of Florida. Oh yeah, the place hasn't been destroyed. They had all that beautiful architecture, wonderful beaches. 90 miles from Florida. It's going to be the big hot one. That to me is one of the biggest investment opportunities coming up.
Gerald, can you tell us how a person could get their hands on the Trends Journal?
Sure, they could go to trendsresearch.com, trendsresearch.com. They get the Trends Journal, which is a quarterly. We have a Trends Monthly. We have this week's Trends. We have Trends in the News broadcasts each weekday night. And we have conferences over here in Colonial Kingston, New York. I mentioned earlier the one we're holding in September. We have one coming up on June 6th. And there's still a few seats left. And one of the speakers at that is going to be Nomi Prinz, who wrote the wonderful book, All the President's Bankers. Again, all things are connected. The banksters are in charge. It's fascism. It's Slavelandia. And unless we the little people stand up with courage, dignity, and respect, nothing's going to change. The future's in our hands, not theirs.
Are solar energy and battery storage in bullish trends?
Well, yes. And they're just going to continue to grow. And it's going to go beyond solar, wind, geothermal, or biofuel. You're even looking at places like Saudi Arabia coming out last week saying that by 2050, alternative energies are going to be the dominant energies. And there are so many new breakthroughs coming through, and we're writing about more and more of them in the Trends Journal. So yes, solar's one, geothermal, battery, but it's going to go way beyond that. To think that we're using, fossil fuels now in the 21st century is really a fossil thought. Again, It's the mother of invention, necessity. And it's going to happen. And when that changes, by the way, do you think the Prime Minister of Canada or the Secretaries of State or the President of the United States or chancellors around the world, all these highfalutin dignitaries, would be going over to Saudi Arabia to kiss the new king's ring if their major export was broccoli? So what I'm saying is nobody's going to care about the Middle East anymore when the oil isn't the dominant energy. And to think about it, from Julius Caesar to Grover Cleveland, the world's kings and emperors and presidents went to their inaugurations and coronations in horse and buggy. And then the alternative was powered cars, and that became the dominant energy. So that's what you're going to see. And then who goes by, candlelight anymore? So that's the big switch. And that big switch will be thrown at some point. And again, when people become free of energy that's being dominated by the oil companies and by nations, you're going to see a lot of big changes take place when people get off the grid and are free to live their lives without domination from other reliant sources. It's going to be a huge change. It'll probably be the beginning of an Enlightenment age, we believe.
The March Against Monsanto took place on May 24th in 38 countries, over 200 cities. Is that a trend, and is there possible investment implications there?
Well, yes. You go back to our Trends Journal. We just did a piece on the trends in the news recently. We showed, I coined the term clean food. We had the clean food trend in 1994. In 1996, I came out with the clean food diet. And I'm bringing this up because the Washington Post just contacted us to remind us that they were doing another story on it, and that how we were the ones that originated it. And then we also go back to trend tracking. In 1988, I said the bottled water would be the big business of the future. So I'm mentioning this not so much, to say, oh, look, we talked about it and forecast it, but this is the future. The future's with clean food. The future's with safe food. You can see it from McDonald's to Taco Bell to one place after another. They're getting rid of artificial flavors, artificial colorings. They're less, trying to get vaccine-free poultry and meat. So this is where the future is. And just to put this into perspective, Jim, let's say, for argument's sake, that humans began to inhabit the earth 100,000 years ago. It took from 100,000 years to 1900 to put approximately 1.5 billion people on the planet. Now we have over 7.2 billion since 1900. So it went from 1.5 billion essentially to 7.2 billion. There's no such thing as a population expert. Nobody's ever seen these numbers before. What I'm saying is there's going to be more demand for high-quality foods than supply. And that, to us, is the business to get into. Because you can see with all these demonstrations that you're talking about, there's going to be fights against the Monsantos, the GMOs. Oh, and by the way, all those liberals who love your Democratic candidates, I'm sure you forgot, I know you forgot, that you could thank Slick Willie Clinton for that one. Oh, yes, he's the one that made it happen. Oh, along with those bovine growth hormones, yeah. So, just to put it into perspective, because people, they don't want to believe that the people that they believed in were the people that sold them out. And you're seeing it again as the new presidential reality show hits the road in the United States, getting ready for the 2016 elections. They lie their way into offices and backtrack once they get in.
Is there a trend in social media enlightening people on what's going on, and will that have an economic effect?
It definitely will. But again, it's limited in the sense that at this point of where we are, people still rely on the mainstream propaganda. Again, look what the prostitutes did with the banks being guilty of felonies. They hardly reported it, and most people don't know it. But again, when you have an ISIS beheading, hey, it's big news because the major media pushes it out. But our friends, those Saudis who I mentioned before, good news, Jim. The beheading record right now is at 88. They beat last year's record, and they're only halfway through the year in beheadings. They only did 87 last year. So the major media still has the influence. However, the trend is clear. And you can see what happened in Spain this past week with the elections, where the Podemos party came from nowhere and got major votes, primarily from alternative media. So that's where it's going to be heading toward. But still, it's the golden rule. Those that have the money rule and have the gold. And right now you have you have actually 6 companies control over 90% of all the media in the USSA. Oh, you lovely liberals who love your guys but never want to call them the liars, cheats, frauds, and traitors that they are. Oh, I forgot. That one was Bill Clinton, too. Yeah, he deregulated the Federal Communications Act. That used to prohibit that from happening. But don't forget to vote for Hillary, because she's just the everyday woman now. Yeah, she got in her van when she announced her candidacy, and they went to Iowa to talk and have little roundtable meetings with the average Jane and Joe Doe. Oh yeah, and she's a champion of the average American. So they keep playing that game. Actually, she's playing the Obama card. He did the same thing. Look what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. When Obama was candidate Obama in 2007 and 2008, he was going to revisit NAFTA because it was hurting the folks. That's right. He went to those Rust Belt those states, and he said that NAFTA was really hurting the industrial base in this country. And when he became president, we're going to do something about it. And then, of course, he did nothing about it. And now he pushed through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which takes more of our jobs and robs us of more of our sovereign rights.
Both Hillary Clinton and Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper are doing their best to avoid the media at any cost. Harper, for example, has refused to take part in televised debates before the October election. Why are they avoiding questions?
Because it would show what hypocrites, liars, frauds, and fools and freaks they are.
Is there a presidential candidate who would be good for the markets?
For the markets, one thing, the markets, what are the markets now? They're a totally rigged game. All the markets are now is shoving in cheap dough at record low interest rates. How many more mergers and acquisitions? Every day there's a new one. Every day virtually. Because they're borrowing the money for nothing, and they're buying up other companies and driving up the stock prices. And the other one is by companies borrowing money for nothing, and then buying back their stock. So the candidates are, they're just, they're none of the candidates have sound economic policies. They say the same thing. We're going to lower taxes for the big corporations, and less government regulations. Yeah, like they're regulated already. So no, there are no plans in place, because the way it happens is, if it's going to happen, is put back into laws that stop the domination of cheap products and slave labor products being made in slave labor countries from flooding into the borders and putting people out of work. The answers are also to, you go back to the Eisenhower years. I mean, the corporate tax for the filthy rich, it was up around 90%, the tax base. Now you have these hedge fund guys that are paying capital gains tax as a, because they're not creating anything. They're not developing new products and services. They're paying these low taxes because of their connections to the White House. So no, and the other thing is to bring home the troops and rebuild the nations. Stop getting involved in foreign entanglements. Fix what you have at home. I get a kick out of these politicians, every one of them. All these little chicken hawks, these guys with cojones the size of mothballs, including your guy up there, Harper, that talk so tough and couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. And how they're going to straighten things out in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Hey, how about fixing Detroit? Oh, if you fix Detroit, go down to Camden. Oh, Camden, you got that fixed? You don't have to go too far to fix Trenton. Then go to Scranton. Go to East St. Louis. Go to country after country, city after city. Fix those up in your own place, in your own backyard. Then you have the right to shoot off your fat mouth and tell me how you're going to do it somewhere else. I'm sick of this. I've had it. And the people should be up in arms. They should be raging mad at the raging lunatics that are ruining their countries. Quote, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men." Samuel Adams.
Intelligent people versus stupid people. Is there a trend there?
Yes and no, in the sense that, again, as Samuel Adams said, it only takes a minority, a tireless minority. Go back to for whatever reasons people want to give. World War I. Whatever country you lived in, a few madmen took you to war and destroyed the world and a good part of it. Take World War II. War after war. The Germans. Now, they could give me the reasons why, Hitler got into power. I know. But the war came to an end. And when it came to an end, Germany was bombed to smithereens. Anybody has to go to any of the big cities and they can see the destruction that's still there in terms of all the new buildings that were put up in the ruins and only the few old grand ones that still stand compared to what was there. How can they let a two-bit freak destroy their country? It was going to come to an end at some point. And again, whether it was Hitler or Mussolini, whether it was Obama, Blair, and all the others that led their countries to war based on lies, it's up to the people to stop it. So yes, there's always going to be, most of the people are uninformed. They're not going to know what's going on. They have other things in their lives. The education systems are failing. It's up, again, as I see it. I shouldn't say as I see it. As a scholar who fought for the freedom of this nation, and that was Samuel Adams from The Tyranny of the Nobility. He said, it's a tireless minority. And again, it loops back. He fought against the nobility, and that's what you have now in the Western world, a new nobility. They roll out the red carpets when their prime ministers, premiers, and presidents and chancellors show up, just like they did in the old days. New sets of rules. The political elite and the economic nobility. So it goes back to Sam Adams, the tireless minority, setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men.
Gerald, can you tell us how a person could get their hands on the Trends Journal?
Sure, they could go to trendsresearch.com. They get the Trends Journal, which is a quarterly. We have a Trends Monthly. We have this week's Trends. We have Trends in the News broadcasts each weekday night. And we have conferences over here in Colonial Kingston, New York. I mentioned earlier the one we're holding in September. We have one coming up on June 6th. And there's still a few seats left. And one of the speakers at that is going to be Nomi Prinz, who wrote the wonderful book, All the President's Bankers. Again, all things are connected. The banksters are in charge. It's fascism. It's slavelandia. And unless we, the little people, stand up with courage, dignity, and respect, nothing's going to change. The future's in our hands, not theirs.
Thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Gerald Celente, publisher of the Trends Journal. Coming up next on This Week in Money, James Corbett.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
Welcome back to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. The following interview is on Skype. It does have some sound distortion because of that. We apologize for that. My guest is James Corbett, editor, publisher of the International Forecaster Weekly, and also the editor, publisher of the Corbett Report. Welcome to This Week in Money, James.
Thank you for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to be here.
And we always mention you're talking to us from Japan. Whereabouts?
I'm on the west side of the main island of Honshu.
Which is in comparison to Tokyo?
In comparison to anything anyone would know, it's about halfway between Osaka and Hiroshima.
My first question is, because Canada is so dependent on international trade with China, in fact, I think the whole world is, how is the Chinese economy doing right now?
The Chinese economy is not doing well, to put it succinctly, I would say, and we see that from a number of different sources of information. Mainly, we see the manufacturing data is tapering as China is attempting to switch from more of an export-based economy to one that is going to emphasize domestic demand in coming years. But unfortunately for the Chinese, there isn't a lot of ways for the Bank of China to do this other than to engage, if not directly, in quantitative easing in the style of the Bank of Japan or the ECB, at least in various types of central bank credit creation tricks. And I think we're going to see more of that happening in the coming years to try to spark some sort of economic demand internally. And I think that there's obviously a lot of different hurdles that the Chinese government is going to have to jump in order to get from here to there. And for an economy that has been built up as a primarily export-based economy, it's going to be quite the transition. And I think we're going to start seeing some of the effects of these, the entire ghost cities and other things that China has been constructing feverishly as a way to try to soak up some of the credit they've been creating over the last several years.
Any sign that people in China are going to move into those empty cities?
Well, there is the plan, the ongoing plan, to move masses from the countryside in what's being called the greatest migration in human history. And I don't know how far along they are in the implementation of that plan, but I imagine that's going to involve the location, forced or otherwise, of large numbers of migrants into, if not into the ghost cities, but certainly into more urban areas in China. So we're going to see more of an urbanization trend taking place, which is obviously going to have an effect on Chinese real estate. And we've already seen the Chinese government moving to try to limit the real estate price rises that would be the result of this growing demand. And that is not a happy thing for a lot of the part of the burgeoning Chinese middle and upper classes that are resentful of the fact that they can't actually get good yields on property values, which is one of the reasons that we see such large capital outflows from China into Canada primarily and in the U.S. as well in terms of real estate purchases abroad.
Recent population reports show China may face actually a labor shortage, something that you wouldn't imagine for a country with such a large population.
You wouldn't imagine it, but it is one of those strange things about demographics. I believe the peak year for births in China was 1989, so we've been seeing declining births for the last 26 years, and that's eventually going to start translating into a declining population. Of course, it hasn't yet, but at some point, that's the way those figures will play out. And because of that, we're starting to see the beginnings of what will be China's long-term demographic crunch. For example, home formation, new household formation, peaked about 25 years after 1989, after the peak birth year. So that would be in 2014. And now, as a result, we're going to start seeing the tightening up of the housing market in China. And that's going to have knock-on effects on the economy in general. And then, of course, there's the coming demographic end of that as we start to see the declining population eventually. Of course, in China, that's really something more that's theoretical and off in the distance. But for Japan, it's an actual lived reality. I think for the last 2 years now, the population of Japan has actually decreased as deaths have outnumbered births.
I remember a story recently where a village in Japan celebrated the birth of their first child in something like 25 or 30 years.
Again, unfortunately, that is not an uncommon story here. We're seeing more stories like that, and we're seeing schools closing because of lack of students or being consolidated. So it is absolutely something that's being felt here, and I think another aspect of that, and exacerbating that, is that the urbanization, the migration towards urban centers in Japan is as intense as ever, and this is really depleting the countryside, so that our rural areas are almost exclusively made up of seniors at this point, and the senior citizen population here, obviously, very, very high compared to the actual working age population. So there's a lot of demographic reasons, if nothing else, not even to speak of economic fundamentals, as to why Japan is not going to be a happy economy in any time in the foreseeable future.
Any thought in Japan in allowing more migration to that country?
That's been the only really feasible thing on the table in terms of combating this demographic trend, but it's not a politically popular one at all. And given that the Abe government, the current prime minister, who's been in power for 2 years now, his base really is a very strongly nationalistic, militaristic version of Japanese patriots that are very much against the idea of allowing more migration. So he has been attempting to float this as one of the pillars of his Abenomics to try to reform the corporate system here in Japan. But those types of reforms go very slowly. So there is some sort of economic awareness that it is going to be necessary to allow more skilled labor into the country, but there's still a lot of political kickback against the idea.
Going back to China, what about the Chinese stock market? I heard in the past week 3 companies tanked and lost $40 billion on their stocks. Is this a warning sign about what's happening there?
I think it should be in a number of ways, and of course there's always the possibility of manipulation in any markets, but especially in a market that's as burgeoning as quickly and developing as quickly as what we see in China. There's obviously going to be a lot of people trying to take advantage of that in any way they can, and as it's not a particularly developed market at this point, the opportunities for scamming and scheming is going to be higher at this point until we start to see the big crackdown on this, which we may be seeing now with these companies tanking in the last few weeks and really destabilizing the Chinese stock market. But still, I mean, the trend is upward as so much credit creation has happened in China over the last several years, and a lot of that is now finding its way into the Chinese markets. So it's definitely an expanding market, but I think there's very real possibilities of a lot of scams and things going on there, and we're going to have to see how the Chinese government attempts to deal with that.
Well, we know when they've had crackdowns in the past, the death penalty is quite possible for people who violate their laws, but again, you have to catch them in the first place, don't you?
That's exactly the point, and I think everyone understands that corruption is endemic in the Chinese governmental system, in the Chinese Communist Party, especially, of course, the citizens of China who have to put up with it, which is exactly why we've seen Xi Jinping in the first few years of his administration really attempting to crack down on corruption at the lower levels of the state governments and levels below that, local officials. Unfortunately, for it, just the way the system is, there comes a point at which basically Xi Jinping can't crack down anymore because he'll start to crack down on his allies in the Chinese Communist Party. So I think there's some degree to which the crackdown we've seen so far has been sort of show trials, or if not show trials, at least throwing some of the lower hanging fruit to the public to satisfy their cravings. But I don't think it's going to get to the fundamental rot of corruption in the Chinese Communist Party, and I think there's going to be a point at which that hits some sort of boiling point with the Chinese population. And unfortunately, when we reach those types of political crisis points, often militarism and military engagement is one solution for the ruling power to maintain its power.
China apparently now owes more money than the U.S. does. Where did China get the money, and what would happen, for example, if they decided not to pay it off?
Well, since the money that they now have is a lot of simply credit creation from the People's Bank of China, I don't think that they're not tapping into national reserves, or they're not tapping into international markets to try to support this. So I don't think that there's going to be that issue, and especially because, unlike the U.S., which is obviously has a capital account deficit, China has a capital account surplus because of a primarily export-based economy. So they are in a relative position of strength. But with that position of strength comes the question of what to do, of course, with all of the reserves. And it's for many years, of course, been China's great problem because they can't simply just bring that money back into the country, because that would obviously greatly affect domestic markets. So there's always been the question of what to do with the reserves, and for many years they were simply parking them in treasuries. Now it seems they're trying to shift tracks with that, and they're starting things like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is not only a way to supposedly be a stopgap in the infrastructure deficit in the Asian region and developing some of their economic partners, but it also gives them some geopolitical capital from their international reserves that they weren't flexing and weren't using before. So I think we're going to see more of those types of multilateral institutions and things that China is going to start creating, seemingly for the benefit of the world, but of course I think primarily for its own benefit, economically and geopolitically.
What about rumors that China in October might announce that it's going to back the yuan with gold?
Well, we do know that China has a lot more gold in its reserves than it officially says. I believe the official statement is 1,000 tons, but we know that it's been importing gold furiously over the last several years, and one would have to assume that in some way or in some manner this has to do with backing up the yuan. Whether they are going to officially try to peg the yuan or to create some sort of actual gold standard, I think remains to be seen, and I'm somewhat skeptical. But I think that the storing of gold and at least the assurance that there is something there to back things up could be less something of a new gold standard for the yuan, and more something to position the yuan as a more stable currency for its upcoming review in the IMF Special Drawing Rights Basket Review. As people may or may not know, the IMF administers a type of central bank reserve currency called special drawing rights that currently can be redeemed in any of four reserve currencies: the U.S. dollar, the British pound, the European euro, and the Japanese yen. And every 5 years they do a basket review to see which currencies should be included or excluded from that basket. And in this year's review, China is very, very much angling to be included in that basket. Last time they were excluded because the IMF said that the yuan was not convertible enough. But the IMF has been making statements in recent months to say that the yuan is now much more convertible and it looks more eligible to be included in that basket. I think being able to come out and say, well, we have actually several thousand tons, X thousand tons of gold reserve in our accounts would be another way of basically ensuring that the yuan will be included in that special drawing rights basket, which I think is important for moving away from the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency and towards something like the IMF special drawing rights, which would be more of a multilateral currency and one that would obviously be more geopolitically and militarily happy or pleasing for the Chinese, who are, of course, afraid of U.S. military encroachment.
How is India's economy doing right now?
India is, as India ever is, which is to say, always underperforming what people believe it could or should be doing. And of course, we've seen in recent years, for example, with that crash of the rupee that happened a year and a half ago, when we started to hear the rumblings about the Fed killing QE. We see how intimately linked in the Indian economy and the Indian rupee itself is to the world markets and specifically to what's going on in the U.S.
The BRIC countries, how big of a threat is that to the established trading arrangements in the world? I
would say not as much of a threat as it's being portrayed in the media, or at least not for the reasons that it is. And I would say that because the BRICS are economically anemic and are in their own troubles. I mean, even the by far the strongest economically speaking of the BRICS nations, China, is having its own problems, as we've discussed. And other than that, Russia obviously still suffering from the sanctions and other economic effects that have been taking place over the past couple of years. Brazil, having had some experience with some growth in the end of the last decade, has been suffering over the last few years, and South Africa not particularly, not even large enough to really to even compete with the others or even be placed in the same grouping for anything other than geopolitical reasons. Of course, the BRICS nations just wanted something in the continent of Africa, so they added the S. But India is interesting because we saw over the past year and a half, we've seen a bit of a bull run in the Indian markets, but that seems to have, if not completely stopped, there's at least been an 8% fall in recent weeks, which is probably due to the elation and euphoria that we saw when the new leadership took over at the Bank of India, and there was supposedly going to be economic reforms. Well, that clearly has failed to materialize, and there are still deep-seated structural issues that really are preventing India from becoming the type of economic giant that everyone thinks it should become. So I think we're going to see some of that bull run in the Indian stock market over the past year and a half basically being taken back, and people trying to get some basically capitalize on their winnings there. So I don't think that the BRICS are economically very strong as a world competitor at this particular point. And geopolitically and otherwise, I mean, I think the development of things like the new development bank are probably very interesting and informative in and of themselves. I mean, we've seen, for example, the new development bank was primarily China and somewhat India's pet project. And now that China's started their Asian infrastructure investment bank, they've basically abandoned the idea, and so the NDB has basically stalled. And I think that's just one reflection of the fact that this is a grouping in name only, and I don't think it's much more than that. They have their photo opportunities at their yearly meetings, but as a coordinated group of economies that are going to somehow transform the world economy, I think that's been overblown. And I think we're starting to see the cracks in that formation.
James, how can people subscribe to your newsletters?
Well, the people can go to CorbettReport.com for all of my work, audio, video downloads, all of that. All of it free and openly available to the public, although I do have a weekly newsletter that they can find information about on the website there. They can also find the International Forecaster directly at theinternationalforecaster.com.
James, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
My guest has been James Corbett, editor and publisher of the International Forecaster, the website internationalforecaster.com. That wraps up our show for this week. I would like to thank our guests, Ross Clark, Gerald Celente, and James Corbett, and thank you for listening. Comments or questions for This Week in Money can be emailed to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. We're back next week with more This Week in Money.
This Week in Money is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.